mean? Every definition is also a boundary. The moment we explain what something is, we begin separating it from everything it is not. A forest is not a desert. A citizen is not a tourist. A scientific theory is not a personal opinion. A friendship is not an employment contract. Each statement creates a distinction. Each one draws a line. That process is called delineation. But what does delineation actually mean? Why do human beings rely upon it? And when does a useful distinction become an unfair form of exclusion? The word delineation comes from a root associated with drawing or tracing a line. In its most basic sense, to delineate something is to describe it precisely, mark its boundaries, or establish its limits. Sometimes those limits are visible. A fence may delineate one property from another. A painted stripe may delineate the lanes of a highway. A coastline delineates the place where land meets water. But many of the most important boundaries in human life cannot be. Laws, identities, responsibilities, relationships, historical periods, and fields of knowledge all depend upon lines that exist primarily because people recognize them. Delineation answers several basic questions. What is this thing? What is it not? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Who or what belongs within it? And which rules apply once that boundary has been crossed? Without delineation, the world would not become more inclusive. It would become more confusing. Consider something as ordinary as a piece of land. A person may own a house, but ownership means very little unless the limits of that property can be identified. Where does the front yard end? Who is responsible for the tree growing beside the driveway? Does a fence stand on one property or another? A surveyor delineates the land so that ownership, access, maintenance, and responsibility can be determined. The line does not need to be a wall. It may exist only on a map and in a legal record. Yet that invisible line can determine who pays for repairs, who may build, and who has the right to enter. Political geography works in much the same way. Cities, counties, states, nations, school districts, and voting districts are all delineated territories. The streets and rivers may continue uninterrupted, but government authority changes at the boundary. Cross one line and a different police department may respond. Cross another and taxes, laws, voting options, or public services may change. Nature also contains boundaries, although they are not always as clean as the lines humans place on maps. Ecologists delineate wetlands, forests, deserts, and watersheds. Meteorologists delineate climate zones. Geologists divide the history of Earth into eras, periods, and epochs. These divisions help people study an enormously complicated planet. But the boundary between one ecosystem and another may be gradual. A forest does not necessarily stop at one tree while a grassland begins at the next. Reality often contains transition zones. This reveals something important. Delineation does not always discover a perfectly sharp line that already exists. Sometimes humans create a practical boundary so that a complicated subject can be studied, discussed, or governed. That does not make the boundary meaningless. It means the purpose and accuracy of the boundary must be examined. Science depends upon careful delineation. Biology distinguishes mammals from reptiles, planets from dwarf planets, and one species from another. Medicine distinguishes one condition from another because diagnosis determines treatment. Psychology attempts to delineate ordinary variations in behavior from conditions requiring professional attention. Those boundaries may change when knowledge improves. A classification can be revised without proving that classification itself was useless. It simply demonstrates that delineation is an ongoing attempt to describe reality more accurately. The same principle applies to time. Human beings divide history into named periods: ancient, medieval, modern, industrial, and digital. Yet nobody living through a historical transition woke up one morning and discovered that the previous age had officially ended overnight. Historical periods are delineated afterward, using important changes in technology, government, economics, religion, or culture. These divisions allow us to organize events and recognize patterns, but they can also oversimplify. One region may enter an industrial age while another remains organized around agriculture. A single date can be useful without describing every person's experience. Delineation is therefore not merely about drawing lines. It is about deciding which differences matter for a particular purpose. Law could not function without it. Every law must establish its scope. Who is covered? What action is prohibited? Which authority has jurisdiction? Under what circumstances does an exception apply? If a rule says that vehicles are forbidden from entering a park, the word vehicle must eventually be delineated. Does it include bicycles, wheelchairs, emergency ambulances, maintenance equipment? A rule that sounds perfectly clear can become uncertain the moment it encounters real life. That is why laws contain definitions. Precision is not decorative language. It determines how power will be used. Benefits and public programs also require delineation. A retirement program must define retirement age. A scholarship must define its qualifications. A disaster relief fund must identify the affected area. A professional license must establish the training needed to practice. Whenever resources, rights, duties, or protections are assigned, some method must determine who or what qualifies. Otherwise, the promise becomes impossible to administer. This is where delineation often becomes controversial. People generally accept boundaries when those boundaries feel distant or obvious. Few people become emotionally distressed because astronomy distinguishes a moon from a planet. But when a boundary affects identity, opportunity, status, or relationship may depend upon birthplace, parentage, naturalization, or some combination of the three. Religious communities may define membership through belief, initiation, practice, or family tradition. Professions rely upon education, examinations, apprenticeships, or licensing. Cultural communities may emphasize ancestry, language, geography, shared customs, or participation. These criteria are not interchangeable. Someone may live in a country without being a citizen. Someone may admire a culture without being a member of the community that created it. Someone may understand medicine without possessing the qualifications to practice it. That distinction is not automatically an insult. Appreciation is not identical to membership. Experience is not identical to expertise. Proximity is not identical to ownership. Similarity is not identity. The existence of a boundary does not necessarily claim that the people inside it are better than the people outside it. A category can identify difference without establishing a hierarchy. A violin is not superior to a trumpet because music delineates them as different instruments. A historian is not inherently more valuable than an engineer because universities distinguish their disciplines. The distinction exists because the categories communicate useful information. In fact, a category without limits communicates almost nothing. If every object could be called a chair, the word chair would no longer help anyone find a place to sit. If every statement counted as scientific evidence, science could no longer separate testing from speculation. If every relationship carried identical obligations, the words parent, neighbor, colleague, customer, and stranger would lose their meaning. To define something is inevitably to exclude things that do not meet the definition. But this does not mean every act of delineation is fair. Boundaries can be created dishonestly. They can be based upon false information, manipulated for political advantage, or designed to protect privilege. A government may draw voting districts to weaken the influence of certain citizens. An institution may create qualifications that appear neutral but have little connection to the work being performed. A social group may invent claims of purity that history cannot support. Delineation becomes dangerous when a convenient category is treated as a natural law, when a flexible boundary is enforced as though it were absolute, or when a distinction is used to deny people rights unrelated to that distinction. The problem is not simply that a line has been drawn. The deeper questions are these: who drew it? Why was it drawn? What evidence supports it? Is the standard applied consistently? Does the distinction serve a legitimate purpose? And what happens to the people placed on either side? These questions allow us to distinguish delineation from discrimination. Delineation identifies a difference or establishes a boundary. Discrimination, in its harmful social meaning, uses a difference to impose unjust treatment. The two processes can overlap, but they are not synonyms. A hospital delineating the responsibilities of surgeons, nurses, pharmacists, and technicians is necessary for patient safety. Refusing someone medical care because of an irrelevant personal characteristic is unjust discrimination. Both situations involve categories, but the purpose, relevance, and consequences are completely different. The same is true in personal life. People delineate relationships by establishing boundaries. They decide what behavior they will accept, what information they will share, which responsibilities belong to them, and which responsibilities belong to someone else. Without those lines, generosity can become exploitation. Friendship can become obligation. Employment can consume private life. Concern can become control. A personal boundary is a form of delineation. It says, this is where my responsibility ends and yours begins. That line may be negotiated, changed, or misunderstood, but some version of it exists in every healthy relationship. Human beings delineate because reality is too large and complicated to understand without distinctions. We divide space so we can govern it. We classify nature so we can study it. We define laws so we can enforce them. We identify roles so responsibilities do not disappear. We name communities so their histories and practices remain intelligible. We establish personal boundaries so relationships can function without consuming the individuals inside them. Yet every boundary carries power. The person who controls the definition may influence who receives recognition, protection, authority, or resources. That is why delineation should never be accepted merely because it sounds official. Definitions must be examined just as carefully as the decisions built upon them. The goal should not be a world without boundaries. Such a world is impossible. Even the statement that everyone belongs creates a category called everyone and delineates it from no one. The better goal is honest delineation, boundaries that are clear about their purpose, supported by relevant evidence, open to correction, and no broader than necessary. Delineation is neither inherently moral nor immoral. It is a tool of thought and organization. It can clarify reality, protect rights, preserve knowledge, and assign responsibility. It can also manufacture division, conceal prejudice, and transform human judgments into artificial walls. So when we encounter a boundary, the most intelligent response is not automatically to celebrate it, or condemn it. We should investigate it. What is being defined? Why does the distinction matter? Who benefits from the line? Who bears its cost? Can people understand the standard? And does the boundary describe reality or attempt to control it? Every definition is also a boundary. The question is not whether human beings will draw lines. We always have and we always will. The real question is whether we understand the lines we are drawing and whether they deserve to remain.